You are listening to Influencers from the Conference Board.
The Conference Board's timely annual survey of C-suite executives is out now, and it provides some fascinating insights for marketers and communicators. What are CEOs around the world focusing on, and how will it help marketers navigate what lies ahead with more certainty if you know what's on their minds? Hello, I'm Ivan Pollard, leader of the Conference Board's Marketing and Communications Centre, and I want to welcome you to this episode of Influencers. Today, I'm joined by senior researcher Denise Dahlhoff as we look at how the roles of marketers and communicators continue to evolve. The work gets more interesting, but so does the pressure. We're going to try and drill down into the survey for what we think the implications are for marketers and communicators, but also give you some insights for what we think you should be considering to take action on. So as I said, we have an expert with us, and then you have me facilitating and trying to pretend I know what marketing's all about as well.
All right. Hi, everybody, and I look forward to our conversation today. So as Ivan already mentioned, this is a survey that we have been doing for a while. This is actually the 23rd year that we're running the survey. This year, it's a global survey of CEOs and C-suite executives. This year, we had more than 900 CEOs participate from around the world, as well as 700 C-suite executives. And the report, it covers actually many of the Conference Board's core topics, and that includes inflation. You know, our chief economist is a co-author of this report. There's a little bit of a deep dive into inflation. Also, the topic of hybrid work. We have very strong human capital center, as well as topics like ESG, and also a comparison between the concerns of US and Chinese CEOs. Very, very timely topic. So there's a lot of rich information in there. So we encourage you to check out the report. And just to give you, some highlights, every year we have two evergreen questions that we ask every year. The first one is on what are the external challenges that you will be focusing on in this next year. And the first five, they're essentially all related to the pandemic in some way. So number one, COVID-related disruptions, yes. Then we have rising inflations, which is sort of the result of many of the things that happened during COVID. Labor shortages in number three, supply chain disruptions and changes in consumer behavior. We have also marked for you how these issues are, where they rank across the world. For example, this first item, COVID-related disruptions, it ranks quite differently throughout the world, at least in some parts. Like look, in the US, it's number 4. In Europe, it's only number 10. But in China and Japan, it's number 1. And the significance of that, especially for China, is since China manufactures many goods for the world, if there are disruptions in China, let's think of the zero COVID strategy in China. If they close down factories or shipping facilities, the rest of the world is affected. So, it's even if you operate in one part of the world, it's really important to look at what's going on in the rest. So that is one interesting thing. The other that I want to point out is here, rising inflation. We're talking about that more, but you're seeing here that is pretty consistently a huge topic across the world. So in the US, it's number 2. In Europe, it's number 1. In China, number 4. I don't know what happened with Japan. It doesn't show up there. But anyway, it's a huge topic across the world. Anyway, we'll get into some of the detail throughout this conversation. But these are just the high-level external challenges that CEOs are dealing with.
So I'll have a look at the internal challenges. So the internal challenges that the CEO is going to face, and remember, this is what's on the mind of your CEO. So you can understand when you're talking to her or to him, the things that are occupying them, because as marketers and communicators, we obviously need to have a real insight into that. as Denise mentioned, we have over 700 other C-suite executives, and inside that, there are around about 115 that are in the marketing and communications space. So if any of you are interested, we could do a follow-up webcast or a report on what's the difference between what the CMO, CCO set are looking at versus what the CEO is looking at. Sometimes they'll be exactly the same thing. Other times it may be different. So if you're interested in that, we can follow up on that. But for the moment, this is what's on the CEO's mind about the issues that they feel they should address internally. Unlike the external issues, there's a real commonality across the world about the number one issue for people, which is actually about attracting, retaining, and rewarding talent. So how do organizations, with what we've been through, with the Great Resignation and the Great Reset, but also with the demands now for working differently and the employee voice being important inside corporations' strategies and prospects. We'll talk a little about that and the role that internal communications must play for that second bit, the retain talent, but also the first bit around employee brand. Accelerating the pace of digital transformation driven by Europe and China and Japan. Interestingly, it's 8th on the list in the US. Now, that's because many companies in the US may feel that they've already achieved it. And in fact, we did a webcast earlier this year about the CMO survey from Duke University, from the Fuqua School of Business. And they were saying that, yes, indeed, many companies have moved from the nascent phase of digital transformation, but they haven't got to the completion phase yet. So people are going a little further. What we thought in our analysis of the research was it's not that it's less important, it's that just some things have risen in urgency with the digital transformation. And then it is worth noting, just a note on sustainability. So you can see it as an internal consideration. See there at number 7. So those of you that called out ESG in the poll, you're right. We're thinking about, and CEOs are thinking about, how do I maintain a culture of and a purpose of sustainability and equity inside the organization of the work. But I just want to go back to what Denise said about inflation, because you've all read the reports and you've all seen what is going on. And you'll see that, around the world, actually, inflation is going up. You noticed that actually deflation is a risk and recession is a risk, perhaps, in China. And there's a very good part of the C-Suite Outlook report that you can download as a member for free and go and have a look at the analysis for what is driving that. But let me just give you just a little bit of background on inflation. Here we can see what is on the CEO's mind. It's not so much consumer price inflation, which is also going up, but the input, the producer price inflation. And you can see it tracked over the last decade here, the last 12 years. 82% of CEOs, and by the way, 95% of CEOs in manufacturing companies are expecting upward pressure on prices. Now, obviously, there are different tactics in different businesses to handle that. Sometimes you try and pass it through the retailer and onto the consumer. In other businesses, you more aggressively market and defend the value of what you have. In other places, there may be a temptation to cut the costs of what you produce. So, if we've got supply chain bottlenecks, could I produce it locally at a lower cost, cut out the shipping, cut out the logistics, manage my supply chain? But ultimately, does that put the price up for the consumer? And the thing that we thought was surprising in the survey is people expecting, despite what the Fed say or what the European banks say, people are expecting this inflationary pressure to last until mid-2023. And then when you think about it, companies that serve customers, whether that's business to business or business to consumer or direct to consumer, they have to think about that end point. Who's going to make the decision about, are you worth paying the money for? I'll just pull a household example up. This is what it seems my 8-year-old children live on. They need their crackers to take in their lunchbox, and then they eat them when they come home. And here is a box of Pepperidge Farm goldfish. And here is my receipt, because I go do all the grocery shopping, and I'm very mean with money. This is our local grocery store called Cub Foods. at the beginning of December, that box of goldfish crackers at Cub Foods cost me $6.99. The price now has gone up here. If I could dial in on it, it has gone up to $9.49. So in 4 weeks, they've put almost $2.50, sorry, on the price of my goldfish. And the honest truth is, I've had to react by telling the children that they cannot eat as many goldfish, because I want to reduce the amount of goldfish that we eat. Not good for Pepperidge Farm, not good for goldfish, probably not good for my kids, and certainly not good for their mum and dad. So this is a real thing. Those of us who that whole grocery bill came to $346 for a week and a half's groceries. It used to be more like $250. So thinking about consumers and customers in business to business and the decisions that they have to make as prices go up, they're going to reassess the value equation. So Denise, what do we need to think about consumers?
Well, actually, I was going to toss it back to you. So my big question is, what do companies are, doing about inflation? Because, they are handed higher costs, as you mentioned, they pass it on to consumers, but there are so many implications for how do you communicate this? You probably want to be transparent with your consumers. I mean, it has been in the news so much that probably everybody knows by now there are many cost factors that are increasing. But also, from your experience in the marketing world, most recently as the global CMO of General Mills, what do companies do to implement, price increases in an inflationary situation? I was going to say, are you now buying bigger goldfish boxes, like a quantity discount, but it didn't sound like that. Even the package, the price went up. But, from your experience, what do companies do?
So as I said, there are probably 3 or 4, tricks that everybody looks at. From my background, the first is to tell the story about why your brand is worth it. So I'll come on to the idea of how PR and social media plays a role in that in a minute. But essentially, we can see from history, if you look at what P&G did in the last economic downturn, they spent money on defending the value of their brands. So spend a little more on advertising, spend a little more on branding. The second thing is, of course, if you are going to put the prices up, you tend to deal those back, especially in the retail market. But even with business to business, you can find ways of promoting. We'll give you 6 months for free if you sign on for 3 years of us as your service provider. So promotions start to become a little bit more fungible. As you said, there's also the bundling opportunity. How do you find ways of adding things together and finding discounts? Or the downsizing. And in fact, this is why consumer centricity is so important. Downsizing is one of the things that people consider. As I said, I didn't downsize the box, but I downsized the portions for the children. So that's another aspect that people can play with. But I do think telling the story, and especially in today's age, when you talk to your corp comms people and your PR teams, a little bit more expectation from the consumer is truth. So one thing that we experimented with when I was at a previous company, General Mills, we actually had some direct-to-consumer opportunities in our ice cream business, and we were sitting in the middle. It wasn't the general inflation from input costs we're getting here. It was supply reduction that put the price up. So there was a failure because of forest fires in one place and because of drought in another. We had failures in the strawberry crop that went in very particular strawberries because Haagen-Dazs was crafted to perfection. So the strawberries, the cost of the strawberries, the one strain, breed, brand of strawberries that we wanted went through the roof. And we looked at doing in the ice cream shops, we explored the possibility of explaining the truth to the consumer and saying, hey, we're going to have to put the price of the ice cream up because the price of the strawberries has gone up. But we promise you that we will take the price back down again when it goes. Now, that's what I mean about exploring the transparency and the honesty. We looked at that. We decided actually in the context of where we were, by selling it through our own shops, not through retailers, we're controlling the price points and we're controlling the messaging there. We decided that it perhaps was not a viable strategy for the longer term. What impact would that have? I was arguing it will have great impact because it shows we're being truthful and honest. Other people were arguing, well, no, because it will disclose what we're still passing the cost on, and you're still keeping your margins up, Mr. Pollard. So I think it's super interesting about all the things that you can do, and obviously every individual business, what it does do is kind of interesting there. So downsize, pack size, keep price up. Those things are all tactics everybody could do, and bundling and promotions and dealing back. I actually do think that we might be entering an age where the communications team plays a bigger role than the advertising team, if that makes sense, in just communicating the truth behind what's going on in your business. And by the way, your employees definitely need to know that truth. So supply chain issues and procurement issues, explaining to your teams, whether you're working in the factory or working in the shop for Haagen-Dazs, you have to explain the why behind the what we're doing. So your thoughts on that, Denise?
Yeah, no, so maybe you were ahead of the times with your idea, about transparency, because I think it has become a bigger topic for consumers. And there are actually some fashion brands that are super transparent on their websites. They tell you in what factory certain items are made. They show pictures. They also give you a list of all the pieces that go into clothing and what they cost, what the cost of labor is and so forth, of shipping. So super interesting. Another thing, and we'll talk about digital transformation, but, of course, e-commerce has also increased the cost a lot, and, through wages and all kinds of other components. But another way might also be to try to get consumers to be part of the process of the delivery, for example. Instead of getting it delivered to your home, you pick it up. It's more efficient, and that way you might save some money. And another thought about just in general, this is a time where people probably try to save money, but it also reminded me of the recession in like 2008 and 9, when there are completely different business models were emerging. Like, for example, as people forgo the bigger luxuries, the little luxuries came into play, like the nail salons, grew a lot. Also, food trucks became super popular. I mean, they were popular before, but they really got a boost from that time. So really interesting. Well, let's see what we'll get out of this one.
Well, let's just go the other way as well. If you look at the car industry, the automotive industry in North America, they've actually had, there was that myth going around that there were 3 things during COVID that you couldn't get: a puppy, a Peloton, or a Porsche. And the idea that cars have gone up in price, and that people, they've almost got to the stage where 17 million cars were sold last year, 15 million this year in 2021. Sorry, 2020, 17 million, 15 million in 2021. And I think the automobile industry has taken the opportunity to change their business model. And from that, we're seeing evidence from consumers, and some of the CEOs that they talked to said this, is that the consumers were used to the idea of going onto a lot and just picking up the car and driving it away. And now we've been trained to go and test drive something, but then be willing to wait 12 weeks for it to be delivered. So it's changing the business model. So with these pressures of inflation and supply chain and disruption, prices, secondhand cars, first out, new cars, prices are higher than they've been for a very long time. And the consumer is changing their behavior. But on that thought about consumers changing their behavior, Denise, what did we learn in the survey about consumers?
So we first need drum rolls now, because we got an amazing finding from the survey. And this is awesome news for marketers and communicators, because the question was, which groups are the most important when your board and C-suite are making decisions? And after all the talk about, the focus on investors and shareholders, and also during the pandemic in particular, the importance of employees, the frontline workers. In this survey, we found that customers came out number 1 across the world. So the customer is still the most important stakeholder group for CEOs. And that is amazing news for marketing and communications. And I want to read you the quick quote by Peter Drucker, which you might have heard. Because the purpose of business is to create a customer, the business enterprise has two and only two basic functions: marketing and innovation. So number two is actually employees, and maybe surprisingly now, shareholders are number three after all this talk where a couple of years ago, people were talking about businesses focus too much on just the investor interests. But, if you don't please, and I'm talking to the choir here probably, but of course, if you don't satisfy customers and if you don't have the right employees that are passionate and enthusiastic about their work, there is no business to be had and nothing to invest in. So maybe it's not too surprising after all, but a really great confirmation for, this group in particular.
I didn't find it surprising, to your point. Obviously, customers, whatever business you're in, the person who's going to pay you for your product or your service, they have to be primary. That's true for the C-suite and how a business runs. What is surprising is that now it's getting more discussed by boards of directors. So the idea of boards of directors are getting involved in your predictions about what a consumer is going to do. So, hey, if we go back to a different working model, what does that mean for retail operations and restaurants and coffee houses in city centres? What does it mean to rent? What are consumer behaviours going to do to the businesses that we're in? So the board being involved, and that was a surprise to me. The idea that business thinks about customers, not. I think maybe the second thing is that notion in the middle there that employees have just jumped above shareholders. Now that's a surprise to me, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but also look at this notion of NGOs and activists and number 7. In fact, another chart in the survey, if you download it, you will find that 30th out of 30 possible considerations for the consumer were shareholder activists. And if you've been watching what's going on with BlackRock and Larry Fink and the letter to his shareholders, holding businesses still accountable, my interpretation of this is it doesn't mean it's not important that it's down there at number 7. It means that ESG is an ongoing, long-term thing that all businesses, especially when you think about, what businesses stand for and why employees care, we have to still focus on that. And energy and the transition to energy, again, that's a correlation with what inflationary costs are going to do. So the input prices to business right now, the transition cost, not necessarily the energy cost of renewable, but to transition to renewable energy cost is taking investment. So again, it's squeezing the pressure on the CEO and the CFO to manage the business margin, which makes it even more important that those in marketing and communications make sure we don't get distracted and make sure we still have the voice of the customer, the voice of the consumer in that workplace.
On that note, Ivan, just even the importance of customer insights and reporting that also to the board is super important. And that could be maybe an expanded or, slightly tweaked role of what marketers and communicators do currently.
Yeah. I think let's just tie these two things together for the CCOs and the PR specialists. So employees, number 2. So risen above shareholders, interesting. And this notion that there's still this underlying intention that companies have to meet their environmental, societal, and governance commitments. So I think when you add those two together, you can understand why the role of the CCO and the whole team, that role is elevating. One, to be able to make sure your employees are engaged in the narrative that's driving the business. And you're going to see a report come out very soon about the Cco Best Practices from a very big survey of 200 CCOs around the globe, actually, and what's important to them. And as the role has risen here for the CCO, they're getting more involved in strategy than ever before and more engaged with the board than ever before. So the elevation of that role, but also the need to hold on to the power of what you're able to do. And internal reputational branding is super important. But, the traditional part of that job that kept everybody busy for a while was managing disruption, managing crises. So this notion that we're the CCO is stepping up into a more strategic role with more power, and yet the workload is still going to increase. Let's not forget that that's going to be a difficult thing to manage. The visibility and the importance of the role you play aligned with the amount of work that you and your teams are going to have to do, because guess what? In the CCO survey, you're going to see that resources are not increasing. Workload up, importance up, resources probably the same for the most part. So if we do go to a more of a hybrid working model, and maybe for us as marketers and communicators, we may get a balance that I'll talk about in a moment about, flexibility to address a talent pool that might want to work differently, and yet also the need to make sure that they work together. 89% of CCOs and CEOs and CMOs are saying that one of the most critical things that we have to do, remember, employees second on our list of things that are important, one of the most critical things we're going to have to do is improve our internal communications. And if any of you have any questions, I can answer more about that. But again, if you read the C-Suite Outlook report, you'll find in there some of the drivers of that and what is keeping people worried about maintaining culture when we move to a remote workplace. So I think that's an interesting interstitial here between inflation, consumer centricity, don't forget your employees, and by the way, telling the story, especially around ESG, you don't do that these days in in a YouTube video or an ad. It's the story that others tell about you there that is probably more impactful. So and also the internal story. So inside of that, we've got this worry. Remember, Denise said at the beginning, one of the external factors, 5th ranked actually around the world, was changing consumer behavior. So yes, consumer centricity, yes, this importance of the employees, but boy, we better keep an eye on what's happening with the consumer. So Denise, consumer, changing behavior.
Let me just add one thing to this. I mean, this is a long list of things that CCOs will be responsible for. And we know they're already overworked now and their teams. So I just wonder, how this is going to continue going forward if CEOs really think, this function is more important, whether they will add, budget to that and people to give them a little bit of a break and to be able to breathe.
We hope you are enjoying this episode of Influencers, our podcast channel that highlights need-to-know information for marketing and communications professionals. In this episode, we are providing insights from our newly released C-Suite Outlook report. As you've just heard, this annual report examines how CEOs are looking at the tsunami of changes coming their way and how they plan to respond. In keeping with our mission at the Conference Board, we provide trusted insights for what's ahead for you and your business. Whether you are a CEO or a member of the C-Suite, you will find actionable ideas to help your organization better navigate 2022. You can read this report and others like it, listen to podcasts, register for future webcasts, and find interactive charts all on our website at www.conference-board.org.
All right, so moving to changing consumer behavior. So let's first look at where this ranks across the world. So globally, it's in number 5. In the US, it's a little lower, but it doesn't mean that it's not as important. In the US, we have a couple of maybe market-specific other priorities, such as cybersecurity and regulation, and they are related. They are also related to consumers, by the way, to protect consumer data, for example, and provide data privacy. In Europe, it doesn't appear, most likely because we had more manufacturing CEOs answer the survey. In China, though, and in Japan, very high in number 3 and 4. And, consumer behavior or changing consumer behavior, there has been so much going on. Drivers of that have been factors that surfaced in the pandemic. So, for example, people staying more at home, not just working from home, but socializing, working out from home, and the home became the center. That changes people's consumption patterns, for example, what they buy. So they bought more for the home, they did renovations, They ordered food in and things like that. But also they didn't buy, in the regular places, for example, around their workplace and so forth. So a lot of the consumption patterns have changed. But of course, another huge topic that increased during the pandemic was digital. So all of a sudden, everything was digital, not just work, not just school, but socializing, working out. People even got married online. There were new ways to provide services. Also, another thing that surfaced during the pandemic was investing. That expanded a lot, also through mobile apps. So consumer behavior changing because of the opportunities of digital. Also, as Ivan has talked about, the inflation and price increases, that also changes consumers' behaviors. They either cut back on things or they switch to private labels, or they change their retailer or package sizes, or delay things. The entire services industry also to engage in the world, like from, all the sports events, to attend in-person cultural events. They changed slightly, for example, and that is connected to new business models as well. So if you can't attend a cultural event in person because of the virus threat, businesses came up with the idea to provide that service virtually. For example, I've seen now you can get a city tour virtually. You can go to a holiday market and have your local guide, walk you through the market. You don't have to go there. So lots of things changed, and there were many factors. So this changes in consumer behavior encompasses a lot, but it also, again, goes back to the point to keep track of all of that is happening, how consumer behavior is changing. And also one thought about, I know we have many B2B members. Ultimately, of course, even a B2B business touches or reaches the end consumer. So even those trends may be of importance for B2B businesses. Ivan, do you have any additional thoughts on changes in consumer behavior?
No, I think if we string these three things together, one of the things that I think we should be thinking about is how we build the case, knowing this data is out there, how you build the case for resources for your consumer insights team, for digital transformation, for corporate communications, and even for advertising. Because obviously one of the other things that CFOs think about when inflation comes from input costs is to cut the marketing budget and to cut the things that they feel are less essential. Hey, we knew the consumer last year, so surely we know them next year. So let's take a few headcount out, or let's not invest in that digital system for managing CRM, for instance. So watch out for that, because I think this data should arm all of us with a good case story to be able to say at C-suite level and even at board level, right now is a time to invest in marketing and communications. It's not the time to look for cost savings here. So I think I'd say that, and actually just talk, Denise, a little about that digital transformation.
Yeah, huge topic. I mean, now it's the air that we breathe pretty much. Also here we see some regional variation, and with the US and China, this item is a little bit lower on the list, and that is most likely because these regions have already been quite advanced on digital transformation. So they already, did some of that or much of that work. In Europe and Japan, that looks a little differently. So there may be still a lot of catching up to do. And one thing to consider in all of this, I mentioned already, B2B. So the companies in the B2C space that are excellent on digital experience, they actually educate or train people to get used to a certain level of convenience, of comfort and ease in all their purchasing, and they're interacting with websites and receiving whatever goods and services they ordered. That really it has a ripple effect and influence on all kinds of other businesses. So consumers are also employees, for example, and they deal in their work lives with B2B companies. So they come to expect, a certain standard in terms of digital. It also sets the bar higher as well for offline businesses because, for example, online you can browse, you can filter, you have full price and information transparency, you have reviews. So now going to a store almost feels like, oh my God, it takes more effort. You have to search more. You don't have all the information at your fingertips. So the expectations are really set higher through this digital. And again, this has an impact even on healthcare. Before, people might accept like longer wait times. Now it's like everything is fast online. You can also get your healthcare online. So it just raises the bar, sets the bar higher for pretty much any business. So digitalization, that's the air that we breathe.
I think that also leads in to the point. Remember, internal pressure, number one, everywhere in the world for the CEO is about talent. And digital is also, we've accelerated, we've packed a decade's worth of digital transformation, according to one of the big consultancies, into just 6 months. And that was the 6 months at the beginning. It's still going on and it's stuck. So we can all see that. But one of the things that it has done is opened up and made people reassess work. So again, in the Outlook paper and then some papers from the Human Capital Center that are coming up, people's attitudes to work, the Great Resignation isn't saying, I am not going to work for a living anymore. It's people reassessing what work means to them and people redetermining the conditions within which they will work. So right now, there's a little more power in the hands of the worker than there is the hands of the employer. And part of that power, fueled by this digital transformation, is this notion of remote work. So a stunning fact is actually 30% of the CEOs that were surveyed are expecting 40% or more of their workforce to be working remote ongoing into the future. Obviously, it varies by different industry sector, but this notion that 1 in 3 companies out there will have almost half of their workforce working remotely is going to put pressure on the system by which we work. So just at the macro level, look at this here. So yes, increasing competition for talent. Yes, they think productivity will go up as we go out there. Yes, they think innovation will go up. But the downsides are things like the strength of culture and this notion of internal collaboration. But when you think about those of us who have to lead the storytelling of a company, whether it's responding to a consumer inquiry or whether it's creating a Super Bowl ad, the stories that we tell in order to frame up the company and the team that you need to do that, when 40% of them are working remotely, or even more in some industries, how do you nurture that culture of buying into the company and the corporate purpose, but also the culture of creativity, innovation, and collaboration? So we saw the rise of some, really great companies from a digital and software perspective that were enabling, workshopping online. And even if you look at the transfer of techniques into Teams and into Zoom, the very meeting that we're having right now, there's a lot more software that allows us to do that, but the interhuman relationships and this ability to see things in 3 dimensions or to touch and feel things and see how your consumer or your customer will respond, those things we're going to have to find a workaround for. So there's a bit here, as I mentioned earlier, that for us in the creative industry, the storytelling industry, whether it's how you interface with an agency or how you run your team, this balance between accepting that flexibility is going to be for many, this idea of, why do I have to drive for 2 hours into an office every day in London if I could work from home? Those things, are going to become part of how we attract and how we recruit talent. On the other hand, we have to balance off the downside about how do we get that talent being as productive, not just in the creativity that they put, but in the relationships that they build with the teams and the loyalty that they build to the company. So I think that's a huge issue for all of us. And I do think there are ways of doing it. Some companies I know, a couple of ad agencies I know, have given up their offices but taken the money they used to pay on rent to have 4 get-togethers a year, doing a brilliant thing on a boat down the Danube or on an island in Hawaii. So they've distributed the workforce. They've got access to more talent because, I can suddenly get a computer programmer to design my website in Latvia and get them to work with somebody who's working in Liberia. So those things are interesting, but this notion of how do you hold on to the culture is going to be super important.
I just wanted to comment on this, really interesting point of innovation, and you point that out as a really crucial point for marketing and communications. But still amazing that 41% of CEOs think it will increase innovation. But on the other hand, you have all this cultural stuff. And, one thought I had is there are many e-commerce brands that were built online. And I think companies can actually learn from these e-commerce business to build a brand culture, how they have done that. How do you do that for your employees? And I think it just involves being more deliberate about many things. We take so many things for granted when you have them all the time. When you go to the office every day, you see your colleagues and things just happen naturally. Maybe this new world just requires more, being deliberate, more planning, doing the things that just happened automatically before. You have to sort of schedule them or plan for them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think people are doing that. Remember, this is the CEO focus on what they're worried about and the opportunities for marketing and communications to step up and take a lead. So the question is okay, with all of this disruption that's going on out there and this uncertainty, perhaps people will reassess their relationship to work even further, whether it's better and safer to be in a company with security and in an office than it is to have to foot the bill and work from home and have to pay your own electricity and heating bills. So there's a lot of different factors coming here, but for the creative industry, the storytelling industry, I think this is perhaps a bigger challenge than many other functions, legal or finance, for instance. I think this is a bigger issue for us because of collaboration and creativity. So with that, they were the 6 big points that we wanted to raise. I just want you to know that there's a paper coming out in the next couple of days. Again, just download it from the website that summarizes some of these things and gives a bit more factual background inside of there. We've also got a conference coming up on March the 9th and 10th, a virtual conference. So again, if you're a member, just sign up and go have a look at it. Where we'll be talking about many of these issues combined with what I mentioned, the corporate communications best practices and what we're seeing from around the world about, as I said, this elevation in workload, more work, less resource, less time, and more uncertainty with more volatility out of there. So how do we hold on to the right that we've got to be at the big table and get people actually, with finding the big table comes to our table now as communicators. So that's going up there. So this is a brilliant question, which is what's the conference board doing to maintain and improve the strength of its culture? I think all industries, all businesses, whether you're, with 300 people around the world for the conference board. So how do you create events and we're still not back in the office, for instance, in New York, and some of our European offices you're not allowed in. So this notion of interconnectivity and being really clear internally about why we do what we do and why we believe it's important to our members, but also listening to our members to tell us what's important to them. So this notion of we've been reinforcing a lot about the purpose of our business. And again, I know we saw ESG come up there as we talked about, but part of the purpose of a business is to actually, essentially maintain its workforce and add value, not just to industry for the conference board, but to society. So we've been reinforcing the purpose of the company, the why. And again, at General Mills, we did exactly the same thing. The CCO rewrote the corporate narrative and we found ways of communicating that. Not once, it's not a one and done. It's not, here's the report, go read it. It was almost like, what's the cadence that you need as communicators is it every 2 days, every 3 days, every week? But you need to build a program for engagement that doesn't overwhelm people with too many meetings, but does underscore the purpose of why you do what you do. And in this conference, I'm sure they'll be talking about that. So we'll be looking at that in the conference.
So the conference board, I mean, we are very strong on values, and the conference board has really placed an emphasis on people, and that includes not just the members but employees and everybody we deal with. So I feel like that has really that's a very strong part of our culture that has been a very perceivable guidepost for us throughout all this time.
Now, the other thing that I mentioned at the beginning was this is the data. This is what's on the mind of the CEO. Of course, we do webcasts, and these are really good other leaders from around the conference board. And one of the things I find incredibly valuable for the marketing and communication aspect here is hearing those tangential things that are going on in the world of economy or the world of human capital. Because when you walk into the leadership team meeting, or when you're talking to your team, knowing about what's going on with inflation or deglobalization, or understanding how company reporting about greenhouse gas emissions, how that's getting managed around the world, those things are not central to the job we do. But when you've got that collateral intelligence, I think we do our jobs better. So if you have one of those times where you've got half an hour between the meeting, go check these out, because I think these are one of the most valuable ways of just seeing what's going on around the world and getting a collateral insight view. You can see into the future slightly to the side and around the corner. I also mentioned that whilst we've just talked about the implications for marketers from the CEO perspective, we also have the data that talks about how the CMOs align with the CEOs and the CCOs. And we can also see the data where they're different. So if you're interested, we will crunch that data for you and find a way of serving it up to you in the future that says, hey, here's we just talked about knowing what's on their mind. How do we get them to understand what's on your mind if you are seeing things differently? So we could look at that, and we will remain a resource for you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Influencers. We hope you'll enjoy future episodes with us, and they'll all be just as good as this one. You can find more about the C-Suite Outlook on our website by looking at the link below, and you can find this podcast series wherever you choose to listen to your podcasts.
This has been Influencers from the Conference Board.